All right, so we're going to talk about folk tales. Now, folk tales is a larger term used for a variety of solar subtypes, such as fairy tales, hero tales, romantic tales. There's a large number of genres when we start talking about folk tales. So we're going to quickly go through what we mean by that. Largely, these are derived from some type of an oral tradition. Most of them are going back 4,000 or even 6,000 years for what they are creating in this situation. Some of the earliest ones go back to the Bronze Age of human history. So we're talking about there's a long history of these types of projects. The general categories of folktales are, well, first of all, folktale, which is derived from the regular people are involved in the story. You might consider it your average person was walking down the street and something happened to them. They are used to mean regular people. It is actually derived from the German Volk, which means people. So it is regular people involved in a story. Now, a secondary type of general category might be animal tales. This is where we see the people replaced with animals, such as maybe the Three Little Pigs or a project like that. It's we're using animals in place of people to help communicate what's happening in the story. Why might someone choose to use animals in the story instead of people, such as Grasshopper and the Ant or Three Little Pigs or something like that? It will catch a child's story. And I like where you were heading with that, that the animals might be easier to draw. And for a storytelling from what we're doing, that might be a much easier take on that approach. But yeah, animals, it's like, oh, there were once three pigs that were talking with each other and a wolf came along. Three little pigs were talking. Why were they talking? Animals can't talk, but that gets the little child's suspension of reality to kick in. It's like, oh, animals talk. When we're not looking, they're talking to each other. So it might really inspire the creativity in someone. So we also have mystical or magical stories. Those are always going to include some aspect of supernatural, something that is outside of this world, a cosmic witch or genie, or something comes into the environment that is beyond our earthly understanding. And that was very typical as we go back into the oral traditions of these stories. If you couldn't explain something, you brought a supernatural entity into it to be able to say these things happen. We also have tall tales. These are with larger than life characters. You might remember from your childhood the story of Paul Bunyan, the giant wood lumberman that would go around in his giant blue ox babe. Anybody remember that? A few people remember those types of, right. These larger than life characters can really bring a lot more into it. And then we get into the genre of fairy tales. These generally start with once upon a time there was. So our religious stories were used for religious teachings. The concept was we wanted to be able to pass the information on from a small group of people to a larger group of people, and be able to continue the religious teachings in a way people could remember it. Now, one of the most important things that we learn from these folk tales is that they used oral methods of passing knowledge from generation to generation. So they tried to make things as memorable as possible, and they used storytelling devices to do that. And we're going to talk about that more in just a few minutes. But they utilized systems to help people remember what it was happening in the story, and so that it would be easier to recall it for that retelling of the story again. And obviously, all of these folk tales would be told multiple times as you were growing up. So it was just simply a part of who you are. You would think about these things, and so that you could tell it to your younger siblings, or tell it to your children when you have that children, or your grandchildren, to pass these on. One of the most interesting, and probably one of the oldest style of folk tales, is the trickster story. This would always include some kind of a trickster or swindler that was trying to take advantage of another person. They would utilize their wits, and frequently these were, again, the volk, the common or regular people that were involved in these. And they would outsmart the king, or they would outsmart the wizard or the witch, or someone who was trying to do a damage or hurt them in some way. So that usually the trickster or swindler was seen as a villain, though in some folk tales they do show up as the hero of the story as well. And then the final type of category is the stupid ogre story. And we see this all through time. You can see it in the story of Odysseus as he's traveling and he meets the Cyclops. What does he do to the Cyclops? Well, he tells him a false name. He says, "I'm no man." And so that when they were going to escape the Cyclops, and other Cyclops come to say, "Hey, what are you screaming about? No man hurt me." Well, then shut up, go back to sleep. It was a story about outsmarting some kind of supernatural being. It was not necessarily an ogre. It might be a witch. It might be the devil. It might be some genie. But it involved the common person overcoming or somehow defeating a supernatural being. So those were very common. And actually, one of the oldest stories, going back over 6,000 years, is the trying to take on the devil and outsmarting the devil. And we can even see that in more modern times, where we have songs about outsmarting the supernatural being. Anybody ever hear Charlie Daniels' "The Devil Went Down to Georgia"? Nobody's ever heard that song. The devil went down to Georgia, and that was listen to it. It's about defeating a supernatural being, and that's a good example of a stupid ogre story. So modern folk tales came about in the concept of a modern folk tale started in 1695 with Charles Perrault. He was I'm not sure what his role was, but he was at Versailles with King Charles in France, and he was dismissed from the court. And so when he went home, he started collecting oral stories because he had all this free time. And this was actually one of the first time that these oral stories began being fixed in a written form. And so he was collecting these oral stories. He published these oral stories, and this is the beginning of the modern folktale. Perrault and then the brothers Grimm, who did their work approximately 100 years later, were very concerned about the telling of these stories to teach morals. Prior to this time, frequently fairy tales and folk tales were the story of the idiot, the story of the fool that bested something. And it was more about life is random. You never know if good's going to come from it or bad's going to come from it. Perrault and Grimm were very focused on the morality, and that only good things happen only to good people, and that the bad people will always in the end reap what they have sown. And so we see a huge change in this focus as we shift into the more modern times, and especially as we move more into the 19th or the 20th century, with Disney coming along and Disneyfying all of the classic fairy tales. Some examples of classics of people taking these stories and writing them down would be Aesop's Fables, Hans Christian Andersen was very famous for writing down many of these stories. Of course, we have Grimm's, Perrault, and then most recently the Disney classification of fairy tale. Yeah, we've got these fairy tales that are happening now. What are some classic fairy tales that everybody's familiar with?
Don't
Little
Trust
Red Riding
Strangers.
Hood. Good. Now, is there a moral underpinning or a teaching to these stories? Some of them, for example, pick one.
Cinderella
Yes.
does not do much. The prince doesn't even remember her face. It's just a shoe.
Yeah, just the shoe.
Just a shoe.
That's a good point. She didn't stand out enough. That, there's a lot of these retellings. One of the most fascinating fairy tales or folk tales that, in my mind, is the Little Mermaid. In the classic Grimm telling of the story, this is the story about that women lose their voice once they fall in love. That the problem becomes really pronounced, that the further they go along in their life, that they no longer have a voice. What are some of the details? In the grasshopper and the ant, we see that you shouldn't work, or you should, that's the backward version of it. You should be working and preparing for your future, and that because the grasshopper did not prepare for his future, he was left out in the cold and left starving, whereas the ant had plenty in his, and had set aside plenty for his own well-being. As we jump into Grimm's, of course, Grimm's, it's the whole, it's named after the two brothers who were academics that were doing this, but now it's become, oh, well, that's a Grimm tale. So we frequently see this in some of our storytelling, that Grimm has become a meaning for stories, that, oh, that's a Grimm tale. It's depressing, it's sad, because at the end, everybody dies. It's can be a real problem. Little Red Riding Hood, what's it about?
Don't trust strangers.
Don't talk to strangers. They are, and especially if you're a young woman, they might devour you. It's a real interesting story, even with some of the classic or the more recent retellings of that story, where Little Red Riding Hood's actually a werewolf. But that's a very different take on the story. We can get some very interesting styles and things happening when we're talking about folk tales or fairy tales. All this to say, the next assignment is to create a modern retelling of a folk tale or a fairy tale, or any of these classifications. What your assignment is for Tuesday of next week is that I want you to come up with a premise for your story, your folk tale. You're going to come up with a basic idea for a story, the foundation of your story, if you will. It should express the basic story in a very simple way. How do we communicate this in as few sentences as possible, but we still keep the gist of the story? So we're going to talk about how to create a premise here. A premise should include who's the main character, a descriptive of the main character. It may not be their name, but it would be a brief description. So Harry Potter might be a teenage wizard. Yeah, that's a descriptive of a young teenage wizard learns, or young boy learns, that he is a wizard. What's the protagonist's primary goal in the story? What's their desire or goal of the main character? What obstacles are keeping the child or the main character from reaching their goals? Of course, in Harry Potter, it's he who shall not be named is keeping him from trying to achieve life and happiness and just get on with it. So how do we create a good premise for a story? First of all, you need to start with a theme. What is a real life problem that the story or this fairy tale can explore? such as what about the problem of poverty and overcoming poverty, or uh, the impact of technology upon our lives, or faith versus doubt, oppression of many by the few. How do we do this? How do we tackle these problems? So what is a good premise? What is the theme of your story? Which, that for a fairy tale, that's what it's all about, is what's the story about? Don't talk to strangers. Don't get in cars with strangers, except now we have Uber. So continue with creating a good premise. Once you've got a theme or something that you want to explore, you need to ask yourself, what if? Now, I'm not talking about the whole new Marvel series that's starting up. Instead, I'm talking about what questions can you ask yourself to help explore what this story is. So for our Harry Potter example, what if a 12-year-old boy suddenly discovers that he's really a wizard? What does he do? Well, obviously he goes off to wizard school. What if you learned your grandparents were in the Illuminati? What if you learned that aliens are real? What if you learned that you can travel in time? What if? Ask yourself, what if, to help you with your story development. And then give your characters a powerful motivation. Why do they want to do what is happening? And the antagonist should also have a powerful motivation. The person that's trying to stop the protagonist from accomplishing their goal. What's their motivation? Why do they do it? It doesn't necessarily have to be evil versus good. It might just simply be conflicting interests. So you need to explore it from that gray area as well as the black and white area. Keep the premise very simple, very direct. It should only be at most 2 paragraphs long. So this is going to be much less than 1 page. Be brief with just enough details that I want to know more, that I'm intrigued by your idea. What's happening in it. Frequently in fairy tales or stories such as that, we see the rule of 3 used, either 3 or 7. 3 and 7 are frequently used for make it easier to pass something along orally. 3 is the smallest recognizable number that makes it easy to remember. So we have the 3 little pigs. The 3 little pigs leave home to build each their own home. And the first pig builds his out of straw, the second one out of sticks, and the third one out of bricks. It makes it easy to remember. It also makes it more humorous because we have this consistency in that storytelling. It can be much more satisfying in using that. So the 3 little pigs is a classic example of helping to tell that story. So events might happen in multiples of 3. There might be 3 acts or 3 characters or 3 something, just to make it a little bit easier to remember. How many people per team? I want to keep the teams on this fairly small because we're talking about the rule of 3s. I'll allow up to 3. How's that? We're going to go with up to teams of 3. When you submit your premise, work with your team. Each team should only submit 1 premise, the same document. Make sure you list on your premise document who's members of that team, but everybody should submit the same document.